All right, so let's dive into this Megalodon 2. The trench thing.
Okay.
You share this really interesting review with me.
Uh-huh.
And it seems like this sequel, this Megalodon 2, maybe didn't quite, live up to all the hype.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to figure out why this monster movie maybe didn't, make as big of a splash as everyone thought it would.
Yeah. I mean, what I found really interesting about the review was this, struggle that that monster movies always seem to have.
Yeah.
Finding that sweet spot between, the spectacle
Right.
and staying true to the science.
Yeah, absolutely. And from what I'm reading here, it sounds like Megalodon 2 really leaned into the spectacle.
Totally.
I mean, you mentioned that opening scene with the Megalodon going head-to-head with a T-Rex.
Oh, yeah.
Talk about a prehistoric showdown.
Right.
I got to admit, even I was hooked right from that moment.
Yeah.
But it definitely sets a certain tone.
Oh, it totally does. Visually, it's stunning, right? But, I mean, in terms of realism, forget about it.
Yeah.
I think that actually kind of reflects this, bigger trend that we're seeing, these big Hollywood blockbusters.
Yeah.
Is just this constant push for bigger, louder, more explosions.
Right.
Often at the expense of, a good story.
Right.
And, a nuanced story.
So right off the bat, it seems like Megalodon 2 is basically saying, we're all about those wow moments.
Yeah.
Forget the science.
Totally.
But does that automatically mean it can't be a good movie?
Right. Yeah. I mean,
Right.
that's the big question, isn't it?
Can you have a monster movie that is both a visual spectacle and also smart?
Right.
I mean, you think about some of those classic monster movies like Jaws.
Yeah.
They managed to create this suspense and terror, but it still felt, kind of believable. Right?
Okay, so let's talk about Jonas Taylor.
Okay.
Our hero from the first movie.
He's gone from rescue diver to, full-on action star in this one. You pointed this out in your review, and I'm really curious, does this change this evolution of his character? Does it work?
It's tricky.
Yes.
I mean, on the one hand, you've got Jason Statham, who is, Mr. Action Hero.
Yeah.
So it's not a super surprising direction for him to go in.
Right.
But then it does raise some questions. Does this make Jonas feel less like a marine expert and more just, a generic action figure?
Yeah.
And does that then kind of take away from that whole focus on the underwater world?
Yeah, and you mentioned in your review that the plot itself felt a little overloaded.
Oh, yeah.
We've got new megalodons, mutant creatures, a giant octopus.
Right.
And we've even got this corporate greed storyline that's woven in.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot to pack into one film.
Yeah.
Was it just too much?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the main criticisms of the movie. It seems like it's trying to do too much.
Yeah.
And in the process, it just kind of loses focus.
Right.
For example, the escape of the creatures from the trench.
Yeah.
That just feels way too convenient.
No.
And then their journey to this tourist-filled island.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Right.
That's pushing it a bit too far, I think.
And it almost seems like this push for bigger, more intense action.
Yeah.
Maybe it came at the expense of character development?
Possibly.
What did you think about the supporting characters?
Okay.
Like Yiming and Maiying, the rebellious teenager.
Yeah, that's another area where the film kind of falls short.
Okay.
All those supporting characters feel really underdeveloped, almost like they're just there to, be monster fodder.
Right.
And even the antagonists, like Montez and Driscoll, they're pretty one-dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
And, a strong villain is so important in these kinds of movies.
Right.
They add depth to the conflict.
Yeah.
And they raise the stakes for the heroes, right?
It's almost like the movie is so busy showing off these amazing creatures
that
it forgets to give us characters we can actually care about.
Exactly. And this brings us back to that, central question.
Yeah.
Can a monster movie be both spectacular and smart?
Right.
Can it deliver those breathtaking visuals, but also have a story with compelling characters?
Right.
With themes that actually make you think.
Speaking of pushing boundaries,
Yeah.
the film also introduces those sci-fi elements, like those pressure-resistant exosuits
Right.
and the mutated creatures.
Yeah.
Did those work for you, or did they feel kind of out of place?
That's where the film gets kind of interesting, right? Okay. Because on the one hand, the sci-fi stuff, it could have been a way to enhance the world building, to introduce some genuinely new ideas.
Right.
But the execution,
Yeah.
it just feels a bit clumsy.
I'm particularly curious about those exosuits. You mentioned in your review that they were actually used in combat. Which seems like a stretch. I mean, is that even remotely plausible?
It's definitely pushing the limits of what's believable.
Okay.
I mean, in reality, designing a suit that can withstand the crushing pressure of the deep ocean, that's a huge challenge. And then adding in, like, combat functionality, that's even more complex. You got to think about things like maneuverability, power sources, and just the sheer force those suits would need to have to be effective weapons.
So it sounds like Megalodon 2 might have sacrificed some realism for the sake of those action sequences.
Totally.
It's like they said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if Statham could, like, punch a giant octopus in his super suit, and then they just ran with it.
Yeah, pretty much.
And, this whole thing about prioritizing spectacle over scientific accuracy. You picked up on that throughout your whole review. You specifically mentioned the pressure suit for Mayang.
Oh, yeah.
Which, logically, it shouldn't even be a factor.
Exactly.
It's like they said, okay, we need a reason why this character is endangered underwater. Let's just stick her in a pressure suit.
Just throw her in there.
It really does make you wonder, right? Like, were they more concerned with making those visually stunning moments than they were with crafting a story that, actually holds up? This brings us to a really important point that you brought up. The movie's total disregard for scientific accuracy. It seems like Megalodon 2 just plays fast and loose with, established science.
Totally.
I'm curious, what are some specific examples? What stood out to you as being particularly far-fetched?
Well, I mean, we already talked about that T-Rex versus Megalodon showdown. Which, like, paleontologically speaking, it's just not possible. But even beyond that, the movie kind of just ignores these huge challenges that these creatures would face, like escaping the trench and then traveling these massive distances. I mean, just the pressure changes alone would be catastrophic.
It's like they just threw the laws of physics out the window.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
And, this whole disregard for scientific accuracy thing, it might be a little easier to swallow if the movie didn't try to also, like, inject this environmental message.
Oh, right. Yeah, you brought that up in your review. This whole contradiction.
Because on the one hand, it's like, hey, pollution and deep sea mining are bad. But then on the other hand, it's like gleefully showing these prehistoric creatures causing mayhem and destruction. It's a strange mix, isn't it?
It's
like they're trying to have it both ways. They want to capitalize on all the monster action. But also seem like they care about the environment. It makes you wonder if they were maybe trying to appeal to a wider audience. Like people who just want pure escapism, and then people who like movies that have, a bit more substance.
It's a tough balance to strike.
It is, yeah. And ultimately, the message just gets lost. And this brings us back to that, that question of balance. Can a monster movie do both? Can it be thrilling and action-packed, but also make you think?
It's interesting that you keep bringing up Jaws. Because, that film somehow managed to do both. I mean, it was terrifying.
Oh, yeah.
But it also got people thinking about our relationship with nature. And the consequences of what happens when we exploit the ocean.
Exactly. Jaws understood that the best monster movies, they tap into those like primal fears, but they also make you think about these bigger issues.
Now, I wouldn't say Megalodon 2 is quite on the same level as Jaws, but it does raise an interesting question. Do we, as viewers, have a responsibility to demand more from these kinds of movies?
That's a great point.
It's
easy to just get swept up in the spectacle, just sit back and enjoy the ride. But maybe we should be asking ourselves, are we okay with just mindless entertainment? Or do we want movies that actually challenge us? That make us think? And maybe even inspire us to, do something.
Because at the end of the day, stories have the power to shape how we see things.
Absolutely.
And even influence, what we do.
And especially in a world that's facing these real environmental threats.
Right.
I think it's more important now than ever to be telling stories that actually engage with these issues.
Right, in a meaningful way.
In a way that matters.
So maybe instead of just accepting these over-the-top monster movies as they are, we should be asking, what are they really trying to say?
Yeah.
How do they reflect our own, anxieties and fears?
Right.
But also our hopes for the future.
Yeah, I think that's such a smart way to look at these films. Because even in a genre that loves fantasy and spectacle, there's always room for deeper meaning and, social commentary.
It's funny you mentioned those pressure-resistant exosuits.
Yeah.
Because it got me thinking.
Okay.
About, real-world technology. Like, what are the actual possibilities and limitations of deep-sea exploration technology?
Oh, that's a great question. That's like a whole area of research.
Yeah.
I mean, the truth is, we're only just starting to understand the deep ocean. The challenges are enormous. The pressure at those depths is crushing. It's completely dark. And the temperatures are extreme.
So, creating a suit that can not only withstand those conditions, but also allow for combat. That's still pretty much science fiction.
For now, yeah.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean it's impossible. Scientists and engineers, they're always pushing the boundaries. We're developing new materials, new propulsion systems, new ways of even understanding the deep sea environment.
Yeah, it's amazing to think what we might find down there.
Oh, totally.
I mean, we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the depths of our own oceans.
It's crazy. It's wild.
And maybe that's part of what makes these monster movies, like Megalodon 2, so appealing. They tap into that sense of wonder and fear.
Totally.
When we think about that vast unknown down there.
Absolutely.
There's
definitely this primal fascination with the creatures that might be lurking in those dark waters. I mean, we've been telling stories about sea monsters for centuries. And those stories often reflect our own anxieties, about the power of nature and the limits of what we can actually understand.
So even though Megalodon 2 might not be the most scientifically accurate film. Or even the most thought-provoking. It does remind us of that, that age-old fascination with the unknown.
With what's out there. And maybe it also reminds us about how important it is to balance that spectacle with substance. Because the monster movies that we remember, the ones that really stick with us, those are the ones that don't just thrill us, but also make us think. And question things. And maybe even re-examine our own place in the world.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From prehistoric showdowns. To deep sea technology. To, why we love monster movies. But before we wrap up this whole deep dive. There's one more thing from your review I want to touch on. The visual effects. You had some interesting thoughts about how the film used CGI. You mentioned that, while the Megalodon and that giant octopus, they look pretty impressive at times, the amount of CGI. Especially during those, surface-level action scenes. Maybe it actually took away from the overall visual impact. So what do you think? What's the right balance when it comes to CGI in these monster movies?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I mean, it's something that filmmakers are always struggling with, is CGI has become such an essential tool. It lets us bring these fantastical creatures to life in ways that we never could before. But like anything, it can be overused.
It's like that saying, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Exactly. And I think in the case of Megalodon 2, maybe they relied on CGI a little too much. When everything is a visual effect, it kind of loses its impact.
Like a sensory overload almost.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes a little restraint can go a long way. Think about those old school monster movies that used practical effects. Like models and animatronics. They might not have been as, visually perfect as modern CGI, but there was something about them that felt real, like tangible. And that made them even scarier.
This whole conversation has me thinking differently about how I watch these monster movies.
Oh, yeah.
maybe I need to be more aware of those CGI moments. Appreciate the work that goes into them.
Right.
But also remember that sometimes less is more.
Totally. I think that's a great takeaway.
Yeah.
Being a critical viewer, it means engaging with every part of the film.
Right.
The story, the visuals, everything.
Right.
And sometimes recognizing the flaws can actually make you appreciate the good stuff even more.
So as we resurface from this deep dive into Megalodon 2, The Trench, what's the final verdict?
Okay.
Is it worth watching or what?
If you're going in expecting some deep, thought-provoking, scientifically accurate exploration of the ocean, you're probably going to be disappointed.
Okay.
But if you just want a fun, action-packed, popcorn movie with some cool visuals, you might enjoy it.
Okay.
Just don't expect it to be, an all-time classic.
Fair enough.
Right.
And hey, maybe this deep dive will inspire some of our listeners to go back and watch some of those classic monster movies.
Oh, yeah.
The ones that really nailed that balance between spectacle and substance.
Totally.
There's a whole world of creatures out there, both on screen and in the real world.
Absolutely.
So whether we're exploring the depths of the ocean or the depths of our imaginations, the most important thing is to keep asking questions. Keep challenging what we think we know.
Right.
And keep searching for those stories that really speak to us.
That resonate, yeah.
Yeah.
Well said.
All right. Well, on that note,
I
think it's time for us to come up for air.
All right.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And until next time.
Yeah.
Keep exploring, keep questioning.
Keep diving deep.
And keep diving deep into the things that fascinate you.